जारी रखो। ये जरूरी है कि आंखों का भरम कायम रहे, नींद रखो या ना रखो, ख्वाब जारी रखो।
Uh, all right. So, namaste and a very warm welcome to everyone present here today. I am Shailendra Rathod, one of the moderators of Graduate Scholars Talk series, and currently I'm pursuing my Masters in Hindi Literature from University of Delhi. आप सभी का ग्रेजुएट स्कॉलर्स टॉक सीरीज पर एक बार फिर से बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। Reconnection begins where noise ends and awareness returns. The GSTS Reconnect talk series is a celebratory return to ideas, conversations, and collaborations that once shaped the intellectual and creative energies of the GSTS community. Conceived as an initiative that honors legacy while embracing new possibilities, the Reconnect series brings back former speakers, scholars, educators, and innovators of ideas who have previously enriched GSTS platform with their vision. By inviting them to revisit, rethink, and re-engage with the initiative, the series embodies the spirit of continuity, intellectual generosity, and shared growth. So you all are welcome to another GSTS Reconnect series. कोविड काल की चुनौतियों के बीच 7 फरवरी 2021 को डॉक्टर मनीष करवार ने श्यामलाल कॉलेज इवनिंग की इतिहास सोसाइटी साक्ष्य के साथ मिलकर एक सार्थक पहल की शुरुआत की थी और यह पहल बाद में स्नातक विद्वान वार्ता श्रृंखला दैट इज ग्रेजुएट स्कॉलर टॉक सीरीज के नाम से जानी गई। इसका मूल उद्देश्य था विभिन्न विषयों पर गंभीर अकादमिक संवाद और ज्ञान विनिमय के लिए खुला लोकतांत्रिक और समावेशी मंच तैयार करना। देश के अलग-अलग हिस्सों से जुड़े वक्ताओं ने इस मंच को समृद्ध बनाया है और उनके योगदान ने न केवल अ, विद्यार्थियों के ज्ञान क्षेत्र का विस्तार किया है, बल्कि महत्वपूर्ण विषयों पर बहुआयामी चिंतन को भी प्रोत्साहित किया है। पिछले अ, 6 वर्षों में जीएसटीएस ने अपने लक्ष्य को आगे बढ़ाते हुए 265 वार्ताओं से भी ज्यादा का एक महत्वपूर्ण पड़ाव पार किया है, जो उसके निरंतर विकास और लोकप्रियता का प्रमाण है। यह पहल इस विचारधारा पर टिकी है कि युवा विद्वान ही भविष्य के संरचनाकार हैं और उन्हें अपनी शोध, विचार और अनुभव साझा करने, सार्थक प्रतिक्रिया प्राप्त करने और नए बौद्धिक आयाम विकसित करने का अवसर देकर अ, ग्रेजुएट स्कॉलर्स टॉक सीरीज एक जीवंत शैक्षणिक समुदाय का निर्माण कर रहा है। यह मंच न केवल संवाद को मजबूत करता है, बल्कि नए सहयोगों, नए दृष्टिकोणों और ज्ञान परंपरा के विस्तार को भी गति देता है। Also, it gives me immense pleasure to acknowledge the remarkable achievements of this initiative. Over the years, it has been honored 3 times by Doordarshan and has been received recognition in the Times of India magazine. Under the G20 Changemaker Summit, one of our sessions was broadcasted live, further amplifying the fact that we reach and impacted our academic journey. Alongside these recognitions, we have also forged meaningful collaborations with educators and academic institutions across the country and across this university as well. These accomplishments stand as a strong testimony to the dedication, vision, and consistent efforts of the GSTS team. The team comprises the founder and advisor, Dr. Manish Karnwar, and the moderators, Mr. Ajay Gupta, Mr. Shubham Tiwari, Mr. Um, Saurabh Singh, Ms. Manvi Saraswat, Ms. Samriddhi Kanpal, and Mr. Manthan Darle, whose contributions have been essential to the growth and success of this initiative. Now, since I have elaborated about this initiative, it is time to welcome today's guest of honor for this 268th Reconnecting Talk session. We warmly welcome Dr. Akriti as the guest of honor at Graduate Scholars Talk series, and we are delighted to have her presence and also looking forward to her valuable interaction and insights with our scholars. Now, before I invite uh, Akriti ma'am, सबसे पहले तो आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है. Although you have been connected with this initiative so far, and you have helped us a lot in bridging this initiative in all these recent years. But before I invite you for your initial remarks and for your permission to start the session further, I would like to introduce you to today's audience. So, Dr. Akriti is currently working as an assistant professor at Department of History, Shyam Lal College, Evening, University of Delhi. And while teaching as assistant professor in various colleges since 2020, Dr. Akriti is a dedicated historian and academic with a strong foundation in gender and sexuality studies, social and labor histories, and colonial and post-colonial historiography. With extensive teaching experiences across undergraduate and postgraduate levels at the University of Delhi, she brings a research-driven and interdisciplinary approach to the classroom. Her work reflects a deep engagement with vernacular archives, questions of law and society, and the interactions of modernity and historical methods. She has presented numerous research papers surrounds mostly around law, life, and labor of sex workers throughout the history, committed to academic excellence, critical inquiry, and inclusive pedagogy. She continues to contribute meaningfully to teaching, research, and scholarly discourse. And of course, as I said, throughout these recent years, she has been a constant part and supporter of Graduate Scholars Talk series. Now, I would like to invite you, ma'am, for your initial remarks and for your permission to proceed the session further. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Shailendra. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
So, thank you so much for inviting me here and for this generous and kind introduction. So, I am really excited to hear Sham's presentation because I have actually heard before him earlier in this same platform, and he's a brilliant presenter. So, I'm looking forward to him. So, all the best, Shams, and thank you, Shailendra. Please start the proceed further.
Yeah, all right, ma'am. So now, without any further ado, I'm handing over the stage to Mr. Shams, who has also been presented her his talk on GSTS 151. She was also the part of the 11 panels of a speaker when we celebrated GST, the completion of 200 talks. And today he will be speaking on the topic. Are we heading right? Epistemic violence and the making of new global intellectual order. So,
And Salendra, I think
over,
also winner of
yeah,
first,
yeah,
second, third. I think so. Huh?
yeah. He has also been the winner of. He's also been the speaker of the year for GSTS year. I think 2024, if I'm not wrong. So it's over to you, Shams.
I hope I'm audible and I'm visible enough.
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Thank you so much, Shalendra, for such a nice and very generous introduction. It always feels coming back home. I can recall that it was 2.5 years ago when I first appeared virtually, though, at GSTS. The title of my talk is Are We Heading Right? Epistemic Violence and the Making of New Global Intellectual Order. I teach English at the Center for Skill Development, Women's College at Aligarh Muslim University on guest basis. Good evening, Adab, Assalamu alaikum. Um, as the title has already been said, it talks about epistemic violence and how it is impacting the global order, the global intellectual order. So in this talk, we are going to identify how the academic contours, the academic boundaries are framed, reframed, and unframed time and again. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information. Yet at the same time, we are witnessing an unprecedented narrowing of knowledge. Or to put it differently, the crisis today is not the absence of knowledge, but the management of knowledge. Let me begin with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who gives us the concept of epistemic violence, a form of violence that operates not through force, but through the very structures of knowledge. Interesting, right? She asks in her seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? At the first glance, this appears to be a question about voice, about whether marginalized subjects can articulate their experiences. But Spivak carefully demonstrates the issue is far more complex because speech in itself is not enough. The subaltern may speak, they may narrate, resist, testify, but their speech does not automatically enter the domain of knowledge. It is filtered, translated, reframed. Often it is spoken over, spoken for, or rendered unintelligible. What Spivak ultimately exposes is this: the problem is not the absence of voice, but the absence of recognition. The subaltern is not simply silent, they are structurally, systematically, and systemically unheard. Their knowledge does not circulate within dominant epistemic frameworks. Their histories are not archived in official records. Their experiences are not granted the status of truth. In this sense, epistemic violence operates at a deeper level than censorship. It determines what counts as knowledge, who counts as a knower, and which narratives are allowed to become history. Let me extend Spivak's question then. The problem is not whether the subaltern can speak, but whether the world is structured to hear, recognize, and archive that speech. And perhaps we must go even further. Who controls the archives? Who designs the curriculum? Who decides what is teachable, translatable, and credible? Because if the structures of knowledge remain unchanged, then even when the subaltern speaks, their speech risks being absorbed into systems that neutralize its force. It is translated without urgency, documented without its politics, included but only in ways that do not disrupt the dominant narrative. This is what makes epistemic violence so insidious. It does not always silence the people. Sometimes it allows speech, but strips it of consequence. And in that moment, we are no longer dealing merely with exclusion. We are dealing with something far more dangerous: the controlled inclusion of voices in ways that preserve the very hierarchies they seem to challenge. Let us now turn to Michel Foucault, whose work allows us to move from the question of the voice to the structure of knowledge itself. Foucault makes a deceptively simple claim. He says, and I quote, "Power produces knowledge. Power and knowledge directly imply one another," I unquote. At the first, this may sound abstract, but its implications are profound. We often imagine knowledge as something that exists independently, waiting to be discovered, verified, and disseminated. But Foucault disrupts this assumption entirely. For him, knowledge is not outside power. It is neutral. It is not neutral. It is not innocent. Instead, knowledge is produced within the regimes of power. This means that what we call truth is not simply a reflection of reality. It is shaped by institutions, discourses, systems of classification, and mechanisms of validation. Foucault calls this a regime of truth. Each society has its regime of truth, the types of discourses which it accepts and makes functions as true. This is crucial because it tells us that truth is not universal. It is regulated. Certain statements are authorized as knowledge. Others are dismissed as opinions, belief, or noise. And this process is not random, it is structured. It takes place through universities, textbooks, archives, research funding, peer review systems. In other words, power does not simply silence knowledge. It produces the conditions under which knowledge becomes possible. This allows us to rethink censorship. Censorship is not only about banning ideas. It is also about organizing visibility. What gets taught, what gets cited, what gets remembered. Equally important, what is never encountered at all. Because the most effective form of control is not the suppression of speech after it occurs. It is the structuring of a word in which certain ideas never emerge as thinkable. This is where Foucault becomes especially relevant at our present moment. We are not only witnessing the policing of knowledge, we are witnessing the pre-structuring of knowledge itself. And in such a system, power becomes invisible. Not because it is absent, but because it is embedded in what we take for granted as truth. Antonio Gramsci, another very important theorist, helps us understand how knowledge becomes accepted. Gramsci shifts our attention from coercion to consent. He writes, The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch in ruling ideas, I unquote. But more importantly, he writes, every relationship of hegemony is necessarily an educational relationship. This is a powerful insight because it tells us that domination does not rely only on force, it relies on agreement, not enforced agreement, but manufactured consent. Hegemony for Gramsci is the process by which a particular worldview becomes natural, inevitable, common sense. It is when ideology no longer appears as ideology. It simply appears as the way things are. And where does this transformation take place? In education systems, culture, literature, and media. In other words, the classroom is not just a site of learning. It is a site where reality itself is interpreted and stabilized. What is included in the syllabus appears important. What is excluded disappears from imagination. Over time, this produces a profound effect. People begin to internalize dominant ideas not as imposed beliefs, but as their own understanding of the world. This is the success of hegemony, and that is the success of a hegemon. No force is required because dissent becomes difficult to articulate. Gramsci also gives us the concept of organic intellectual. These organic intellectuals are the individuals who emerge from within social groups, articulate alternative visions, challenge the dominative narrative. And here lies the tension. For organic intellectuals to intervene, there must exist spaces of debate, institutional openness, and epistemic plurality. When these shrink, hegemony intensifies. At that point, education ceases to be a space of questioning. It becomes a mechanism of reproduction. It reproduces ideology. It reproduces hierarchy. And it ultimately reproduces silence. Let us now turn to literature and then the next slide. Not as a decorative cultural form, but as an epistemic apparatus, one that produces, legitimizes, and circulates knowledge. Literature is often approached as an aesthetic expression. This is true. This must be respected. But this framing obscures its deeper function as a site where authority is constructed and contested. The literary canon in particular is not an organic accumulation of the best works. It is the historically produced structure shaped by institutions, curricula, colonial histories, and cultural power. The so-called universality of William Shakespeare, and this is coming from somebody who has a master's in English literature, is not self-evident, but institutionally secured through centuries of pedagogical repetition. We often say that Kalidas is Shakespeare of Indian drama, but we have not heard Shakespeare being called Kalidas of English literature. His elevation to the status of the universal author reflects not only the literary merit, but also the global dissemination of English as a colonial and post-colonial language, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues in Decolonizing the Mind. And here he says, and I quote, "The domination of a people's language by the language of the colonizing nations is crucial to the domination of the mental universe." I unquote. This formulation is critical because it reveals that language is not a neutral vehicle of communication. It is an instrument of epistemic control. To think in a language is, in many ways, to think within the cultural and conceptual limits that language carries. Thus, the canon becomes not merely a collection of texts, but a mechanism through which certain ways of knowing are normalized while others are excluded. At the same time, literature also serves as a site of resistance as counter-archives that challenges dominant epistemologies. Consider Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, a text that directly intervenes in colonial representations of Africa. Achebe's oft-cited assertion that, and I quote, that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, I unquote, encapsulates the epistemic asymmetry embedded in historical narration. What Achebe achieves is not simply the telling of an alternative story, but the reconfiguration of narrative authority itself. He exposes the partiality of colonial knowledge and re-enters and recenters the indigenous perspectives within the domain of literary and historical truth. Similarly, Wo Thiong'o's insistence that, and I quote, language carries culture and culture carries the entire body of values, I unquote, underscores the intimate relationship between linguistic form and the epistemic content. To reclaim language, then, is to reclaim the capacity to produce knowledge on one's own term. In the Indian context, this corrective function becomes particularly visible in the text emerging from marginalized locations. Works such as Karuku by Bama and Jhutan by Om Prakash Valmiki do not simply add new voices to the literary field. They fundamentally alter its epistemic coordinates. These texts foreground lived experiences as a form of knowledge, challenging the abstraction and erasure that characterize dominant caste narratives. In Karuku, Bama articulates the everyday violence of caste not as an exceptional occurrence, but as a structuring principle of social life. And my colleague Aliza is here. She has worked on Bama. She's a research scholar in Jamia. Correct me if I'm wrong. Similarly, Jhutan exposes the normalized degradation embedded within caste hierarchies, rendering visible what dominant discourse seeks to obscure. These works resist incorporation into a sanitized national narrative. Instead, they insist on the persistence of inequality and the necessity of confronting it. Their marginalization within mainstream curricula is therefore not accidental or incidental, but symptomatic of a broader reluctance to accommodate epistemic disruption. The politics of literary representation becomes even more pronounced in cases where texts provoke intense public and institutional reaction. The controversy surrounding satanic verses by Salman Rushdie is often framed in terms of religious offense, but such a reading is insufficient. At stake in this controversy is the question of narrative authority. Who has the right to interpret, fictionalize, or critique deeply held beliefs and identities? The response to the novel reveals the limit of tolerance within both the state and societal frameworks. In the contemporary moment, the production and circulation of literature are increasingly shaped by global systems that regulate visibility and value. Perry Baudou conceptualizes the literary field as a field of forces, a space structured by power relations, in which different agents, authors, publishers, critiques, institutions compete for symbolic capital. His assertion, and I quote, "Symbolic power is the power to constitute the given through utterances," I unquote, is particularly instructive. It suggests that the ability to name, to classify, and to legitimize is itself a form of power. Within the global literary economy, this power is unevenly distributed. Anglo-American publishing houses, literary prizes, and academic institutions play a disproportionate role in determining which texts achieve global circulation. Translation, often celebrated as a bridge between cultures, can also function as a filter that reshapes text into fit dominant expectations. The best example is William Jones's translation of Bahar-e Danish from Persian to English. He does translate the text, but in the footnotes and in the acknowledgement, he appropriates the text according to the Western audience. This broader structuring of knowledge finds a parallel in the measurable decline of academic freedom around the world. The data emerging from global indices and monitoring organizations indicate that restrictions on intellectual inquiry are no longer confined to overtly authoritarian regimes. Instead, they are increasingly visible across a range of political contexts, including democracies. The documentation of hundreds of attacks on higher education annually by organizations such as Scholars at Risk underscores the scale and persistence of this phenomena. These attacks take multiple forms: the dismissal or arrest of scholars, the cancellation of lectures, the restriction of research topics, and the politicization of curricula. I must not give you examples. Look around you. Think beyond what is presented. The significance, when met with such incidents, becomes routine. They reshape the expectation of what academic life entails, fostering a climate of caution and censorship. The warning that attacks on higher education undermine everyone's freedom is therefore not merely rhetorical. It points to a structural condition in which erosion of academic autonomy has far-reaching implications for the production of knowledge itself. What is at stake is not simply the freedom of individual scholars, but the integrity of epistemic system in which democratic and intellectual life depends. Across contemporary political contexts, what becomes striking is not merely the presence of restrictions on knowledge, but the reoccurrence of identifiable strategies through which such control is exercised. These strategies, while varying in intensity and form, reveal a shared structural logic. The regulation of knowledge not only at the level of content, but at the level of possibility itself. One of the most visible mechanisms is curriculum control in the United States. Recent years have witnessed the proliferation of book bans and legislative restrictions on the teaching of race, gender, and systematic equality. And this is not the story of US alone. Look around you, as I say again. These interventions are often framed in language of neutrality or parental rights, yet they function to delimit the epistemic scope of education by excluding frameworks such as critical race theory. What is at stake here is not simply the removal of specific texts, but the narrowing of interpretive tools through which social reality can be understood. In contrast, in China, curriculum control operates through a more centralized apparatus where educational content is explicitly aligned with state ideology. Historical events deemed politically sensitive. Listen carefully. That's the story of China. Historical events deemed politically sensitive are systematically omitted or reframed, producing a tightly regulated narrative of history, removing periods of history of the nation. Despite differences in political system, both cases demonstrate how curricula becomes instrument for shaping not only what is known, but how it is known. A second strategy emerges in the form of institutional discipline, where universities themselves become sites of regulation rather than inquiry. In Turkey, for example, particularly in the aftermath of 2016 coup attempt, thousands of academics were dismissed under emergency decrees, often without due process. This was not merely an act of punitive control. It functioned as a signal, establishing clear boundaries around acceptable intellectual activity. Similarly, in Hungary under Viktor Orban, who has recently lost the election, universities have been systematically restructured through their transfer of state-aligned foundation, thereby reducing institutional autonomy. The effective banning of gender study program across the country further illustrates how entire fields of inquiry can be delegitimized through administrative mechanisms to both contexts. The university is transformed from a space of critical engagement into a managed institution, where intellectual production is subtly or overtly aligned with political priorities. And I say again, look around you. Equally significant is the process of discursive policing, which operates through less formal regulation and more through the reframing of dissent itself. Across multiple contexts, critical scholarship and intellectual disagreements are increasingly characterized as anti-national, disruptive, or ideologically suspected. This shift is crucial because it alters the terms of debate. Dissent is no longer understood as a legitimate component of democratic or academic life, but as a threat to social or national cohesion. Absurd, right? Such framing has a chilling effect, not only discouraging overt critique, but also reshaping the boundaries of what can be safely articulated. Over time, this produces a climate in which self-regulation becomes internalized and the need for direct intervention diminishes. It is within the broader global framework that the Indian context must be situated. India occupies a particularly complex position, functioning simultaneously as a site shaped by Western epistemological inheritance and the locus focus of emerging internal knowledge restructuring. This dual positioning produces what may be described as a condition of epistemic convergence. On one hand, Indian academia and literary production continue to operate within global hierarchies of knowledge that privilege Western frameworks, methodologies, and languages. On the other hand, there is increasing tendency towards selective reconfiguration of knowledge within national systems. The result is not a simple replacement of epistemic order by another, but an intersection in which global standards of legitimacy and local criteria of acceptability jointly shape the contours of knowledge. In such a configuration, intellectual autonomy is constrained from multiple directions, making the space for crucial inquiry increasingly precarious. Perhaps the most significant and least visible transformation within this landscape is what may be termed epistemic preemption. Unlike traditional forms of censorship, which operates after the articulation of the idea, epistemic preemption functions prior to expression. It shapes the conditions under which ideas can emerge in the first place. When scholars anticipate institutional or political repercussions, they begin to self-censor. When universities seek to avoid controversy, they preemptively exclude certain topics. When students are never exposed to dissenting perspectives, they lack the conceptual vocabulary to even formulate alternate viewpoints. In such scenarios, control is no longer external, it becomes internalized. This is what renders epistemic preemption particularly insidious. It produces conformity without the need for overt coercion. It is here that the warning of Hannah Arendt becomes specially resonant. Her observation, and I quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is people for whom distinction between the fact and fiction no longer exists." And this is what we are seeing around us. People watching cinema, which is fiction, which is made, which takes a longer time, which takes a storyline to make. I'm thinking that this is the truth. God damn it. Well, when individuals are no longer equipped to distinguish between competing truth claims, not because of ignorance, but because of the systematic erosion of critical frameworks, the very possibility of informed judgment is undermined. In such a context, the crisis is not merely one of restricted knowledge, but of distorted cognition, where the capacity to question, where the capacity to interpret and evaluate is progressively diminished. What emerges then is not simply a controlled intellectual environment, but a reconfigured epistemic subject, one whose engagement with knowledge is already circumscribed by the structures within which it is produced. What then does literature risk becoming under such conditions? If the processes we have traced of epistemic control, narrative filtering, and institutional regulation, it continue to intensify. Literature risks a profound transformation in its very function. It risks losing its capacity to unsettle, to interrogate, and to disrupt. It seeks becoming not a space of critical engagement, but a domain of managed expression. In such scenario, literature is no longer a challenging power. It no longer challenges power either. It becomes subtly and often unconsciously to reproduce it. The danger here is not always overt censorship or prohibition. It is the gradual normalization of a literary culture in which certain themes are preferred, certain narratives rewarded, and certain forms of critique rendered undesirable or unsustainable. As Toni Morrison reminds us, oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is the violence. This formulation compels us to recognize what language itself can become, a site of domination, shaping not only what is said, but what can be imagined. When literary expression is constrained, whether by market pressures, ideological boundaries, or institutional expectations, it does not merely reflect a diminished freedom. It actively participates in the production of limitation. Morrison's further assertion that the function of freedom is to free someone else extends this argument into the ethical domain. Literature, at its most vital, does not exist in isolation. It expands the horizons of others. If it ceases to challenge, to question, to make visible what is obscured, it ceases to perform its emancipatory function. In that moment, literature may continue to exist as a form, but it is emptied of its critical force. In light of this, the question of corrective measures becomes not simply desirable but urgent. Any meaningful response must move beyond superficial inclusion toward structural transformation. The decolonization of knowledge, for instance, cannot be reduced to the addition of marginalized text within existing frameworks. It requires a reconfiguration of the frameworks themselves, the epistemic assumptions, methodological priorities, and evaluative criteria that determine what counts as knowledge. Without such restructuring, inclusion risks becomes symbolic, leaving intact the hierarchy that seeks to challenge. Similarly, the expansion of the literary canon must be understood not as an act of token representation, but as a fundamental rethinking of literary value. To incorporate texts like Jhutan or, for that matter, Valmiki, Bama's Karuku, is not merely to diversify reading list. It is to confront and transform the criteria through which literature is interpreted and taught. This process demands an engagement with plurality, that it is not additive but transformative, one that destabilizes the coherence of dominant narratives rather than accommodating differences within them. This brings us to the role of pedagogy. The transformation of knowledge systems must be accompanied by transformation in how knowledge is taught and engaged. Paulo Freire articulates this with clarity when he writes that education either functions as an instrument or as the practice of freedom. This dichotomy is not merely theoretical. It captures the fundamental tension within educational systems, whether they reproduce existing hierarchies or enable critical consciousness. A pedagogy of freedom does not transmit knowledge as fixed content. It invites interrogation, fosters dialogue, and encourages the questioning of assumptions. In doing so, it equips the individuals not only to consume knowledge, but to participate in its production. In this context, that the words of George Orwell acquire renewed urgency. And he writes, in the time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Orwell's statement is often invoked, but its implications bear repeating. When systems of knowledge are structured in ways that obscure, distort, or limit understanding, the act of articulating alternative perspectives becomes inherently political. The struggle, therefore, is not confined to questions of governance or identity. It extends to the very domain of reality, its construction, its representation, and its interpretation adheres to. Before I give a pause to my speech, we must understand what is at stake. It is not merely the content of knowledge, but its conditions of possibility. When those conditions are controlled, shaped, or restricted, ignorance ceases to be an accidental gap. It becomes instead a structural outcome produced, sustained, and normalized. In recognizing this, we also recognize the urgency of resisting it, not only by preserving spaces of inquiry, but by reimagining, everything that surrounds us, not only by adding voices, but by transforming these structures that determine how those voices are heard. And I hope that I'm able to make point and I'm able to make people understand that how it is important to, do away with the things that are forcibly being done in the academic circle of this country. Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Shams. That was once again, a very thought-provoking talk by your side, and certainly it was very deeply engaging and full of clarity. And we really deeply appreciate the intellectual generosity you brought to this particular talk session. Talking about knowledge, whether you have it or not, in either of the cases, it is fatal, because in either of the cases, it provides you power. And having said that, the one question which I would like to ask you, since we are also proceeding to the Q&A session, that in what ways are power and knowledge connected in shaping what is accepted as right or valid in the global discourse? You are mute, Shams. Kindly unmute yourself.
Can you please once again repeat the question only? How power and knowledge can...
Yeah, okay. So the question is that in what ways or how power and knowledge connected in shaping what is accepted as right or valid in global discourse?
You see, it actually depends on how you're talking about acceptance of knowledge. You see, it depends on the people on whom that particular knowledge is. I mean, people to whom that particular knowledge is catered or imposed. Both the ways can be understood in their own dimensions. Power and knowledge have a very intertwining relationship. You see, there are certain governments around the world who only want their ideology, their own way of interpreting knowledge, their own way of making people understand them better, their own way of gaining votes on various bases. All right. And this is how, for example, I mean, you see, people, they curse North Korea a lot. All right. People have cursed Libya a lot. Colonel Gaddafi was the most venomous terrorist America could ever had. But you see, when you and he was labeled as somebody who is feeding children his own ideology. And how is that done? It is done through schools. It is done through universities. But there is one distinction that I would like to establish